chapter 24, verse 4, to the end of chapter 25, that's verse 46, gives us the sayings of the discourse. The sayings of the discourse are divided into two major sections. Verses 4 to 31 give us the signs of the end. 4 to 31 give us the signs of the end. This is what the disciples asked for. What are the signs of thy coming? Signs of the end. So Jesus proceeded to list them generally and specifically. The general signs are given in verses 4 to 14. The specific signs are given in verses 15 to 31. Certainly. 4 to 14 are the general signs. And verses 15 to 31 are the specific signs. The general signs, for example, are religious confusion, political upheaval, natural disasters, medical disasters, anti-Christian sentiment, all that sort of thing. Anti-God sentiment, secularism. Generally speaking, people are going to be like this when the Lord returns, or just before He returns. Specifically, He refers to the desecration of the Jewish temple. That's going to be a specific event. Boy, when that happens, people that are familiar with the scriptures, boy, they ought to just run. Okay? There's going to be unmatched tribulation. This is going to be unleashed. There's going to be, he's going to try to be killing the Jews, the Antichrist. There's going to be an increase in false saviors. There's going to be cosmic aberrations like moon turned to blood, sun dark, and stuff like that. I saw a guy on television yesterday. I'm telling you, it was fascinating to listen to him. He believes that Matthew 24 has already happened, and that we are now just sitting on, the trip is just about ready to slip off, and we're headed for space. Sort of, Christ is going to come. I don't know what he was. I don't know whether he was Seventh-day Adventist or whether he was Christian Scientist or what, or a cult. He comes from Edmonton. He was a slick speaker. He was good. But he said that, I'm using an example, March 3rd, 1857, there was a dark day, and this fulfills the sign that Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24, that the heavens would be darkened. So he's treating it as actually historically fulfilled already. Right? Stuff like that. Okay? And then the greatest earthquake that the world has ever seen happened in 1856, and this and that. That's one particular interpretation that a lot of people will go to the book of Revelation like they come to the end of Matthew and they say, it's all happened. That's basically the all-mill view. That we're not looking for a future coming of Christ to rule on the earth literally for 1,000 years, because what the Romans did in 70 A.D. to Jerusalem fulfilled these predictions. Okay? Of course, there was no such thing as the moon turning blood red, and they'll try to say that the smoke coming off the city of Jerusalem turned the sky a hazy red, and that's the fulfillment of it. That's the way they interpret it, as historically already fulfilled. It's kind of stretching it. I believe this is still future. Generally speaking, we live in a time that matches this. Jesus Christ is going to come back very soon, I believe, because we have religious confusion, military, political upheaval, natural disasters, anti-God sentiment, growth of secularism. It's all there, but the temple of the Jews hasn't been desecrated. The Jews aren't being hunted down, man, woman, and child, with the Antichrist yet. Stuff like that. The sun and the moon? Yeah, I almost said the sun and the mun. They haven't experienced those things that Christ predicted here in chapter 24. All right, so those are the signs of the end in verses 4 to 31. General signs and specific signs. Then starting with verse 32 and going to the end of chapter 25, that's chapter 24, verse 32. all the way to the end of chapter 25, verse 46, we have the times of the end. And what we have here in this large section are 5 or 6 parables. It's all parables. So they're a unit. There are 5 or 6 parables all dealing with the time aspect of the end. Every one of them. He talks about the parable of the fig tree. He talks about verse 43, the householder. You know, if the guy had known that a thief was going to break into his house, you know, he would have stayed there with his camera so that he could have sued the guy and made twice as much. No. He talks about the faithful and wise servant as opposed to the foolish servant there at the end of chapter 24. In chapter 25, first few verses, it talks about the parable of the 10 virgins. Some were ready, some weren't ready. They were too late. We're talking about the time aspect. See? And then he talks about the parable of the talent starting in verse 14 in chapter 25. The guy went away for a long time and then he came back, all of a sudden, caught them. They weren't ready. Question?
Were they Christians? All 10 virgins?
You're not going to like my explanation. See, the problem with trying to interpret Matthew 25 as if this has some relevance to me today, is that you're taking something that was spoken in a very explicit, very specific context. Christ was speaking to disciples. He was answering 2 specific questions. What are the signs of your coming and what are the time of your coming? All right? That's the setting of it back in the first part of the chapter 24. So he was answering them, and he was looking at the city Jerusalem, and it's Jewish context there. Everything in these 2 chapters is Jewish-oriented, right? Not that it doesn't have any applicability to us today, because I believe that these signs that he predicted are going to be experienced by Gentiles as well before Christ came.
You can't take the rapture out nothing there. You can't, there's no breakup because it's pointing to the Jews only.
Yes. Matthew 24 has nothing to say with the rapture, but I'll get back to that. Let me answer her question first. This parables here have everything to do with teaching general readiness. They have nothing to do, I don't believe, with teachings explicit, like you either are one of the 10 virgins or you're 5 ready virgins or one of the others. You know, like this is going to be fulfilled at the second advent, right? Not at the rapture. I don't believe it has anything to say specifically about the rapture. The word rapture isn't found, but the coming is found. Many references to the coming. And the kind of coming is very explicit. It's a coming in the air in power and glory. Look at verse 31. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him to be gathered all the nations. You're talking about the actual advent of Christ, right? He's coming to the earth in power and glory and judgment and reigning. So that's the second advent. There's going to be a kingdom following that, a 1,000-year kingdom, right? And the same thing in chapter 24. If you back up, it says in verse 29 and 30, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. It's a visible thing. They'll all see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He shall send his angels with a great sound of trumpet. They'll gather together the elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Verse 30 of chapter 24 and verse 31 of chapter 25 both talk about the same thing. Right? And the reason he's duplicated here is because he's answering one question in chapter 24 and he's answering the second question in chapter 24 to 25. See? So they both bring them to the signs of this event and then the times of this event. That's basically what you have in the Olivet Discourse. It's not a confusing thing. He's giving you general and specific signs leading up to this, how Jews can tell when it's actually going to be. You know? And I believe that the godly Jews that are alive in the world during the tribulation period that survive the Holocaust of the Antichrist, Matthew 24 and 25 are going to be the most valuable scriptures they possess.
This is for the Jews,
I believe it.
not for the Gentiles who become Christians.
Well, we're not going to experience it directly. You know?
Okay. So when someone preaches on the parable of 10 virgins, if they're preaching that as being for the church, they're wrong.
Not entirely. I'm simply saying is that it teaches general readiness for the return of Christ. Well, if you're ready by faith, you'll be ready. You know, see, if you believe in Christ, you'll be ready. If you've got the Holy Spirit in your life, see, the oil, you know, then, if you're a true believer, you possess the Holy Spirit, you're ready. You're on go. See? So, but some people want to teach all kinds of things for Christians out of these two passages. For example, this is what this guy, he didn't even mention belief in Christ. Not once on this television program. He totally missed the gospel. He never mentioned the blood of Christ, Christ dying for sins. He never mentioned any of that. His whole message was bound up in, you got to be ready for the return of Christ. Here are the signs. And he just botched it all. Just lumped it all together. For here and now. There was a song that came out in the 60s, I believe. Life was filled with guns and war, and everyone got trampled on the floor. I wish we'd all been ready. Children dying to be. Okay, you all know that one? That's based on Matthew 24. Okay, we'll come to your question now, okay? Matthew chapter 24, verse 36 to 41. Of that day and hour knows no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Now he's answering the second question, which is, what is the time of your return? The time. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. As in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. And knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken, the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. Now, generally speaking, I could preach from this passage, and I could, as a Christian, preaching to people in the church age, I could preach readiness for Christ's return. And that's what the all-mills do. They take all the coming passages in the Bible and they say, get ready. Right? Pre-mills shouldn't have any problem doing the same thing. Because I believe everything an all-mill does, I believe more. You know, I believe that I should be telling people to get ready. In fact, if you go to, I may be losing you here for a minute, but 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is rapture. Right? Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those that have fallen asleep. Right? Wherefore comfort one another with these words, because the dead in Christ are going to rise first, then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with meet the Lord in the air. That's the rapture passage that goes along with 1 Corinthians 15. But the next chapter in 1 Thessalonians 5 isn't rapture at all. It's second advent. And Paul is writing to Christians. And I could do the same thing with Matthew chapter 24 and 25. I could take the second advent scriptures and teach Christians who are not going to be alive, they're not going to be on the earth when this happens, but simply because it's a future event and there are signs and it's necessary for people to be ready for it, you can teach general readiness because Christ is coming back in judgment.
If you were to teach readiness from this passage, and that is you would first give the primary meaning of it, that it is for the Jew before you would.
Yes, I would explain it as we did tonight in terms of a Jewish context. And then I would probably finish my message off by going to 1 Corinthians 15 or 1 Thessalonians 4 or one of those other passages where it talks about the rapture and saying specifically, you know, the only person that will really have to worry about this is the person that doesn't make it in the rapture.
Will people who knew Christ or have not returned to accept Christ? Or the rapture has an opportunity after the rapture. I heard that it could.
Well, is it 2 Thessalonians chapter 2? Second Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10 and 11, describing Satan's lying power and signs and wonders. There with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they received not the love of the truth, that they might be saved, and for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they shall believe the lie. Now, I believe that many people are going to be saved during the tribulation period. Thousands of people are going to be saved. And they won't all be Jews, right? But it's going to be pretty tough, because there's going to be extra strong, there's going to be a delusion by God working in the minds of men who didn't love the truth when they had a chance. I wouldn't say categorically that a person who was alive before the rapture and didn't believe Christ will never be saved. I wouldn't say that. But I wouldn't want to risk it either. Right? I don't know if that answers your question. This passage here in Matthew 24 is actually talking about, getting back to your question, that two shall be in the field, one shall be taken and one left. And this is used as the scriptural basis for that song that I wish we'd all been ready, which is used in The Thief in the Night for the rapture. Thief in the Night is all about Patsy missing the rapture. See, and she goes into the tribulation. Well, they got the general scheme right, but they misinterpreted Matthew 24 for their theme song. It's not a rapture passage. There's going to be a similarity between the rapture and the second advent, in that some people are going to be left and some are going to be taken. That's no doubt true, insofar as it goes.
Isn't it?
What?
It's the opposite, isn't it? Like in the second advent, those who
are taking are the ones
are the ones who are going to be damned.
Verse 31 in 24 here says the angels will gather the elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other. So it says that some shall be taken. In chapter 24 of Matthew, Matthew 24:31, along with these two verses that we just read, at the mill, and in the field, some will be taken. I believe those people are taken, if they're the elect, they're going to be taken and saved. And then the ones that are left will be judged. But if you go to the next chapter, it says that in verse 32, that he shall separate them one from the other. The shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. He'll set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. And he blesses the sheep, and he curses the goats. Right? Now, I don't know. There are other passages that have to do with the actual order of events. Ezekiel talks about him taking Israel into the wilderness and purging the people. Not all Jews will go into the millennium either. Right? So he may take his elect, that is the Jewish nation per se, and he may take them out there and kill half of them for being unbelievers. He'd kill more than half of them today. Almost all godless over there. But then Jeremiah talks about him purging the people, and Isaiah, some of the prophets talk about the judgments of these people that relate to Matthew 24 and 25. I don't know if that helps. But.
Well, I thought the ones that were taken, the ones that were left, are the ones that went into the kingdom. From Matthew.
Yeah, that could be right. My dad corrected me one time when I preached this sermon at church. He came up to me afterward and he said, "I agree with that. The only thing is, I believe that the people who are taken are taken out for judgment, and then the people who are left, they're the ones that survive and go into the kingdom." It's it's not all that important, but that may be more accurate than what I said. I just don't know where he would actually get that. That's all.
Steve, couldn't you say that the people that were taken and the others left, they were left to suffer through the tribulation because they didn't believe all these
But this is describing Christ coming at the end of the tribulation. The judgments that are going to occur, see, tribulation is really the judgment on Israel, the 70th week of judgment that Daniel predicted. All right? Then Christ is going to come, and at the time of his advent to earth, there's going to be associated judgments. Judgments of the nations, judgment of the Jews as a nation. It's going to culminate in the purging of God's people. Right? Satan is going to be bound. Right? He's going to be cast into the pit for 1,000 years. Right? So there are several judgments that will occur at that time. So, let's try to finish off this outline before we lose our whole thing here. So far I've given you major division 1 is the setting for the discourse going through 24:3. The sayings of the discourse go through chapter 25:46. That large section is divided into two. The signs of the end, verses 4 to 31, general and specific signs. And then verses 32 to 46 of chapter 5, going from the middle of chapter 24 to the end of chapter 25, are the times of the end. Now, there are 5 parables here. The first parable, in verses 24 to 35, isn't that the fig tree parable? Shows that the time will be signified. The time will be signified. That is, that there will be an indicator that this is the time. Just like, if we explain the simplicity of the parable, when I see buds on the branches in the orchard in the spring, what is the natural? Yeah, that's a sign that spring is just around the corner. Okay, so that's what Jesus said. There are going to be signs that time is just about there. Okay, the second parable, and the third parable, and the fourth parable, those servant parables at the end of chapter 24 and the 10 virgins parable at the beginning of chapter 25, those 3 parables all have one thing in common. And that is that the time will be unexpected. Unexpected. If the householder had expected the thief to break in, he would have stayed home. See? When there are good and bad servants working together, if they had expected the man to come back at a certain point in time, they wouldn't have got caught. See? So the point is about those parables that Christ's return is going to be an unexpected thing. The same thing with the 10 virgins. The main point of that parable is that he's going to catch them unexpectedly. Unexpectedly. That's the nature of the time of Christ's coming. It's going to be an unexpected event. It'll be signified. There will be signs. He just gave you general and specific signs. The time will be signified. The time will be unexpected. The last parable in verses 14 to 30 in chapter 25 teaches that the time will be inescapable. Inescapable. Those guys that were doing or not doing things with their talents, there's no way to get out of it. Inescapable. There's no mention here that he caught them unawares. See? That isn't the emphasis in this last parable. He didn't catch them unawares. Nothing says that. It says he came back after a long time and he reckoned with the servants. And there was no way of escaping his audit, if you will. Okay? Inescapable. And then, chapter 26, verses 1 and 2, you have the subsequent events to the discourse. That's the third major division. The subsequent events to the discourse. Jesus predicted he was going to be betrayed and crucified. To the discourse. Subsequent? It means events coming afterward.
Like right after this, all of it, this.
Hard on the heels of.
Just of the times he's talking about.
No, of what Jesus taught. Like when he finished saying these words, then what happened? I think we should take a... Oh wait, we've haven't spent enough time on Matthew, but we're going to move on to Mark. I would like to say that at this point in the course, you're supposed to have completed 2 of those assignments. For those of you who are auditing the course, I would suggest that you make a little stab at them anyway, just for your own benefit. You should do something on it. Okay? Even if you don't want to hand it in for a mark, you should take an hour and try to do something on it. I didn't say that would be sufficient. I said you should do something on it. Spend an hour on each one at least. All right. One of the assignments that you were supposed to start with was the synoptic problem or question. Yes, chronology. One of the assignments you're supposed to do was the so-called synoptic problem or the synoptic question. Synoptic comes from 2 Greek words: soon, which means with or together, and optic, the verb behind to see. Right? And so the synoptic gospels are the 3 gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that see Christ's life basically the same way. Right? No. I'm just introducing something in Mark I'm starting in Mark by introducing something, reviewing something. Right? The 3 gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are the so-called synoptic gospels. John is the autopic, or optoptic. That's not the right word. But anyway, he has his own view of Christ. Right? Now, the synoptic problem or question has something to do with the authorship, because some people say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke borrowed and shared material, and that really that Mark actually didn't write Mark, or that Mark didn't actually write Mark, and Matthew didn't actually write Matthew, and that Luke didn't actually write Luke. Most of the guys that, the scholars, quote unquote, don't believe that. Right? Now, there are scholars that will discuss it intelligently and come to the conclusion, yes, I believe that Mark wrote Mark, but he may have used other sources. Well, that's all right to recognize that, because the Bible doesn't say that Mark wrote Mark. The title that somebody added to the book later says that Mark wrote Mark. Right? Same thing with Matthew and Luke. The titles of these books were later added. Okay? And so it becomes quite a complex thing. For example, there have been different movements down through church history that have stressed different things about the science of Bible background and where the text of Scripture came from and things. You have one group called source criticism, source critics, and then you have the form critics. I don't want you to write this down, okay? But I do think it's important just to say it, right? And then you have people that have come to believe the oral tradition view. right? And then you've got the traditional view, right? And when you're going to discuss the synoptic problem or try to understand it, you've got to take these different groups of schools of thought into account. The traditional people say, yep, Matthew wrote Matthew, and Mark wrote Mark, and Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John, period. And they'll give you quotations from early church historians and theologians to that effect. For example, let me just read you a couple. The traditional view of the authorship of Mark, for example, is that a man by the name of John Mark from Jerusalem wrote the book. He was a younger companion of Paul, Barnabas, and Peter. There's a very early statement that goes back to about 140 A.D. That's a long time ago. And they actually have a copy of what this guy wrote. His name was Papias. And he wrote this, quote, Mark, who was the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he remembered, whether of sayings or doings of Christ, but not in order. For he was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord. But afterwards, as I have said, he accompanied Peter, who adapted his instruction as necessity required, not as though he were making a compilation of the Lord's oracles. So then, Mark made no mistake when he wrote down these same things as he remembered them, for he concentrated on this alone, not to omit anything that he had heard, nor to include any false statement among them. And then there's another writer that said Mark was called stumpy-fingered because his fingers were short in relation to the rest of his body. Now, he was Peter's interpreter, and after Peter's departure, he committed his gospel to writing in the parts of Italy. That's also written within 200 years of Christ. And then another famous church father by the name of Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, wrote this. He said, Mark was written, quote, when Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. After their departure, Mark, Peter's disciple, has himself delivered to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. And so all three of these early statements that were written within 150 years of Christ's death by early believers indicate that Mark had a close relationship with Peter, that he either was taught by Peter or wrote down Peter's words or something to that effect. Right? And this is called tradition because it comes from the writings. Now, sometimes traditions are completely false, but in many cases they're accurate, original documents that basically tell us what happened. Right? So tradition is sometimes questionable, but generally is reliable. Right? And tradition is always held to the same authorship that you thought, that you believe about these books. Okay? Now the source critics, they don't work on those assumptions. They automatically assumed that if the gospel according to Mark, quote unquote, at the top of the book wasn't part of the original Greek documents, where did it come from? Somebody must have put it there. It was inserted by somebody. And so they started from a different perspective, and they assumed nothing. And so they started to compare the material, like Scroggie does, for example. And he evaluates the material of the source critics quite a bit in his book. That's why it's such a valuable book, because he actually gets down to the nitty-gritty and compares all the 50 or 60 sections in Matthew compared to the 30 or 40 sections in Mark, compared to the 50 or 60 sections in Luke and those in John, and he compares them to see which ones are similar, which ones are only found in Matthew, which ones are only found in Mark, and so forth, which ones are shared by all of them together, which ones are in this order, which ones are in changed order, and so forth. It becomes very technical, right? You get easily lost in that. And these guys basically came to the conclusion that Mark was the earliest of the Gospels, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark, and then both of these guys used an unknown source that the critics have called Q for the German word Quelle, which means source, and they made it a real scientific jigsaw. yeah, there are certain portions of Matthew that are identical to Mark, so that must have been where Matthew got his information. And then there are some things that are only found in Matthew. Well, he must have got it from Q over here. We don't know. They have no evidence that Q existed. You understand the sort of reasoning? These guys believe that Mark didn't write Mark, right? They believe that it was the earliest of the writings, and that it's who knows who wrote it. Throw their hands up in the air. Then the form critics come along, and these guys started about 1920, and they are the baboons of theology and psychology. These guys get right down to questioning, well, precisely. It was never even written in this form. There was no such document as a Matthew or a Mark or a Luke or a John in the early days. Basically what happened is that the Christians decided that they... how did they explain this? It's so far out I can't even remember it. The form critics believed that the Gospels were merely the creation of stories to meet the early church's needs. That the events found in the Gospels weren't even historical. Jesus didn't actually do any miracles. The Christians, however, divinized him. They made him more than he actually was. He was really just a man, but they attributed to him miraculous power, and they created in their minds these stories of him raising the dead and healing the sick and all this kind of stuff. That's form criticism. German rationalism at the extreme. And so they basically said that there's none of these things are even historical. So what you do is you chop out anything that's miraculous, and then you're starting to get close to the truth. Actually, there was a real nice guy by the name of Jesus. He was a moral man. He certainly wasn't God. He was probably an Essene spiritual leader, and on and on and on.
I was just going to ask, isn't there historical proof that Christ raised the dead or he healed the person? Like, is there, just not just our Gospels.
In the Gospels.
But other than the Gospels.
The Jewish, Josephus and some of the Romans, Tacitus, Pliny, they'll refer to the historical person Jesus. Sometimes they make a reference to his alleged activities.
Okay, but they do that. Like,
Oh yeah,
there's
historical.
So these critics really just basing it saying that the Gospels were, they're not basing on anything that other people have written.
That's right. Right. Then there's these oral tradition people that come along, and I think they're probably the most.
That's what he brought me, young. What a nice guy.
These oral private joke, Ken. The oral tradition people are the pretty common sense guys. They go back and they show that it was common for people to learn by memorizing stuff orally. That it was passed down from father to son orally. That these people had trained memories. This is the way they did stuff. They didn't have paper industry, ink industry, all this other stuff. And so it's very likely that Peter did teach Mark what Peter saw with his own eyes that Jesus had done, and what Peter had heard Jesus say. And that Peter had memorized this stuff. The disciples had all memorized these discourses word for word. And that later on, when Peter was preaching and teaching to converts, that Mark would have become very familiar with this, and that sooner or later Mark would have summarized the key things that Peter kept majoring on in his teaching and his preaching. Things that were important from Peter's perspective, from what he remembered from the life and teachings of Christ. So this is the oral traditions. And the oral tradition people basically say that there's no reason why a fellow with the name of Mark couldn't have written down at some point in time, maybe in Aramaic, or somebody, in Aramaic even, the teachings of the oral teachings of Peter. Right? But that eventually someone, and we don't know for sure, You know, it's up in the air. I can't answer that question with any dogmatism. Who actually wrote Mark in the form that it's in now? I don't know. Maybe Mark did. Maybe he wrote it in Greek, right? But maybe he wrote it in Aramaic, and then somebody else translated it into Greek. Okay? I personally believe that Mark wrote it in Greek, right? In the form that we now have it. That's why not? Why complicate it? Right? But anyway, these are the various views that you have regarding and it makes a difference on the date of writing as well. The form critics or the source critics make Mark really early. They would say, well, the very first documents from which Matthew and Luke borrowed were probably in existence 49 to 50 AD. You know, you're talking real early. Mark, by these people, is considered the earliest of the Gospels. And I was reading another guy who believes this, and he comes to the exact opposite conclusion, that since Mark is the shortest, the simplest, most pared down version of all the Gospels, I'll read it in his own words here, because he can do it. This is pretty good. He says, the distinctive omissions and unique and vivid details included in Mark and the unique framework that he has may best be explained as an oral tradition, that is, that Peter passed it on to Mark, just like Papias said. And he gives 3 statements in support of this. Number 1, oral tradition and oral repetition generally leads to conformity rather than diversity. If we all had to memorize something, it would be more likely that if we were to write down what we had memorized, that we would all memorize less than more. Right? That's the idea. Right? And secondly, such speakers would be elderly, unimaginative teachers with a desire for uniformity in their pupils. You know, these people weren't interested in trying to spruce things up and to make it brand new. They were trying to get their students to get the basic thing. You know, never mind unnecessary detail, learn the basics. And thirdly, stories passed on in this manner would be simplified. Events would be boiled down to the basic bare bones, and to teach and not to entertain. He says, therefore, Mark is not the most primitive and least developed gospel, like these people said it is. In his view, Mark is the most developed gospel because it's the shortest, it's down to the bare bones, it's the one that's been passed on the most by the oral tradition people. The one that was used the most. It was pared down of all but the significant facts. And so he says it points for a date of the original contents given to Peter, certainly during the first century when Peter was still alive. He says that it makes sense that Mark actually got his material from Peter. Now who knows, he says, when it was actually put into the form we have it. It's not important, I guess. Okay? So the author and date of writing is kind of a tough question to answer for these Gospels. Are you thoroughly confused? It all depends on who you're talking to. The source critics will place them sometime before 70 AD. The oral traditionist people, which I believe are probably on the best track, they'll place it, later in the first century. Okay.
What does it matter to you?
Well, because you have to have an answer for the question. Who wrote the book of Mark? And then when you begin to give an answer, somebody else is going to, especially today, like we live in a world where you have all kinds of liberals as well as conservatives. And if you're having a Bible study with some friends that go to who knows what kind of a church, and you're talking about, and they're going to say, but our preacher said something about, I don't know, we didn't understand it, but on Sunday he was saying that Mark didn't write the book of Mark. What are you going to say? You've got to have an answer.